Before humans walked the earth, before cities and civilizations, even before the first mammals dared to step into the light, there was another age, a time when giants ruled. For more than 160 million years, dinosaurs were the masters of the land. They were not merely monsters of bone and claw, but living creatures of astonishing variety, some small and quick as birds, others colossal enough to shake the ground with every step. They filled every corner of their world, from lush forests and sweeping plains to deserts and swamps, shaping ecosystems with their power and presence. Yet their story is not only one of triumph, but also of fragility. They rose from humble beginnings after Earth's greatest extinction, adapted into rulers through traits of strength and endurance, and then, in an instant of cosmic chance, saw their world undone. Their bones lie buried as fossils, silent witnesses to both the grandeur of their reign and the suddenness of their fall. The tale of dinosaurs is not simply about creatures long vanished, it is about life itself, its capacity to rise, to dominate, to endure, and to perish. It is about resilience, change, and the deep history written into the stones beneath our feet. To follow their story is to journey across millions of years, through fire and shadow, through growth and collapse, and to see how their legacy still lives on today, in the flight of birds and the imagination of humankind. The world that greeted the dawn of the Triassic was not the world anyone today would recognize. It was a wounded Earth, scarred and hollow, still reeling from a catastrophe so immense that life itself had nearly vanished. This was the aftermath of the Permian extinction, the Great Dying, when nearly every creature in the seas and most upon the land had disappeared. Entire forests had withered away, the reefs of the oceans had collapsed into rubble, and the skies carried the hush of an emptied stage. If one had walked the continents then, they would have found vast stretches of barren soil, cracked and red beneath an unforgiving sun, with only scattered pockets of stubborn survivors clinging to existence. What caused this devastation was not a single blow but a chain of disasters. Volcanoes in what is now Siberia had poured out unimaginable floods of lava, smothering the land in fire and choking the air with smoke. From those eruptions spilled clouds of gas that thickened the atmosphere, warming the planet to fever heat. Oceans, once alive with coral reefs, fish, and strange armored creatures, grew hot and sour, their waters poisoned with chemicals that suffocated countless forms of life. As plants withered and animals fell, entire food webs collapsed. It was as though the earth itself had reset, stripping away most of what had thrived for hundreds of millions of years. Yet even in that devastation, there were survivors. A few tough plants clung to the soil, their roots anchoring life's return. Scavenging reptiles scuttled across the land, finding refuge in what little remained. In pools and rivers, small amphibians endured, their lives precarious but persistent. These were not the majestic creatures that would later rule, but they were the fragile seeds of what was to come. The extinction had torn away the old world, but in doing so it cleared a vast and open space. And open spaces invite change. The continents themselves were united in a single immense landmass, the supercontinent Pangaea. Stretching nearly from pole to pole, it was a world of extremes. The interior lay far from the oceans and baked beneath scorching heat, deserts so wide that crossing them would have seemed endless. Along the coasts, the air was gentler, rivers wound through green lowlands, and forests began to take tentative root again. Storms swept across this great continent, carrying rains that carved valleys and nourished new growth. The land bore the marks of a planet healing itself, even as it remained restless, with volcanoes continuing to spew and the ground trembling beneath shifting plates. In this strange new setting, the animals that remained faced a world without the towering giants that had once overshadowed them. Before the Great Dying, the land had been home to mighty amphibians that lurked in swamps, enormous insect species buzzing through the forests, and sprawling reptilian beasts with sail-like backs and tusked jaws. Now, almost all were gone. In their absence, small, wiry reptiles darted across the bare ground, testing the limits of their endurance. Some were little larger than lizards, yet they had inherited a world with room to grow. With their quick legs, scaly hides, and ability to endure dryness better than the amphibians, they were poised to take advantage of every opportunity. Life began to diversify again, tentatively at first, then with gathering speed. Plants reclaimed the soil, sending up ferns and cycads in green waves. Insects adapted, buzzing from leaf to leaf. Streams carried fish that were tougher and leaner than their ancestors, survivors of poisoned waters. On land, new kinds of reptiles experimented with form and behavior. Some grew long necks and sturdy legs, grazing on the low plants that spread across the plains. Others sharpened their teeth and became swift hunters. The world was no longer empty, it was a patchwork of pioneers, each pressing outward into the space left by the fallen. The climate still swung between harsh extremes. Summers burned hot, winters bit deep, and the land groaned under both flood and drought. But hardship shaped resilience. Creatures learned to survive not by sheer size, as in the past, but by adaptability. The small, the quick, the clever, these were the ones that thrived. Mammal-like reptiles, distant ancestors of the warm-blooded beasts to come, prowled in the shadows. They hunted at night, their bodies better suited to the chill darkness. By day, other reptiles claimed the open ground, basking in sunlight to fuel their energy. Each species carved its niche carefully, for resources were still scarce, and survival meant competition. As centuries turned to millions of years, these small struggles added up to great change. Evolution never works in leaps, but in countless tiny steps, tested again and again by the pressures of survival. A slightly longer stride gave an animal an edge in chasing prey. A tougher hide turned aside an enemy's teeth. A lighter bone made movement quicker and more efficient. Bit by bit, across the Triassic, a new caste of creatures emerged from the shadows. The earth, once desolate, now stirred with promise. The silence after the extinction was giving way to the sounds of life returning, the rustle of leaves in forests reborn, the splash of fish in rivers, the cries of reptiles beneath the vast skies. The old rulers had been swept away, their era ended in fire and ash. In their place stood the pioneers of a new age, unassuming at first, but destined for greatness. For within this struggling mix of survivors and newcomers lay the beginnings of the dinosaurs, creatures that would not just fill the empty stage but dominate it for over 150 million years. The Permian extinction was a tragedy on a scale almost beyond comprehension, but it was also a turning point. It was the crucible that forged a new world, the reset that allowed different kinds of life to rise. Without it, the dinosaurs might never have found their moment. The land was harsh, the seas uncertain, the climate brutal, but opportunity often hides in adversity. And so, from the ashes of disaster, the seeds of the greatest rain Earth had ever known began to take root. The curtain had lifted on the Triassic stage, and though the actors were still small and unassuming, the story that followed would be grand beyond measure. The Triassic world was restless and alive with possibility. From the devastation of the Permian, life had begun to claw its way back, and the scars of extinction were slowly being overgrown with new forms of green. Across Pangaea, ferns and cycads stretched across plains, forests of conifers reached skyward, and strange new animals prowled the landscape. It was not yet the age of dinosaurs, though their story was about to begin. For now, other creatures ruled, and the first dinosaurs were no more than small, swift shadows moving at the edges of the stage. The masters of the land were the archosaurs, a broad and powerful group of reptiles whose ranks included sprawling crocodile-like hunters, heavily armored beasts, and predators with jaws built for crushing bone. Some were the size of modern buses, thick-bodied and menacing, their footsteps shaking the ground as they marched across riverbanks and open floodplains. In this world of giants, the early dinosaurs looked insignificant. They were slender and light, with hollow bones and narrow bodies. While the larger reptiles lumbered heavily, the early dinosaurs darted between them, quick-footed and nervous, their survival depending on speed and awareness. These first dinosaurs were not the rulers of their time. They were underdogs, pressed into the shadows of more imposing creatures. When an enormous predator like Postosuchus stalked the forests on its pillar-like legs, the little dinosaurs vanished into the brush or fled across the plains, vanishing into safety before its jaws could close around them. Against such power, their only advantage was agility. They were too small to fight, too fragile to stand their ground. And so they survived by moving swiftly, by noticing danger before it struck, and by living in the margins where the great reptiles could not easily reach. Yet in their smallness lay the seeds of their future. Their bones were light, their legs tucked beneath their bodies rather than sprawled out to the sides like most reptiles. This upright stance, awkward and strange at first, allowed them to run longer and faster than their competitors. Where heavier beasts tired quickly, these early dinosaurs could pursue prey or escape predators with endurance that others lacked. Some began experimenting with balance, rising up on two legs, freeing their forelimbs to seize insects or small lizards. These steps were not taken in a single moment but across countless generations, each tiny change tested by survival, until speed and nimbleness became the signature of their kind. The environment rewarded such qualities. The Triassic was a land of extremes, its climate hot and often dry, its storms sudden and violent. Floods swept across plains only to leave them cracked and barren once the waters withdrew. Creatures that were too specialized often perished when conditions shifted, but those that could adapt, those that could run to new feeding grounds, or hunt a variety of prey, or survive on less, found ways to endure. The early dinosaurs fit this mold. They were not locked into one way of life. Some stalked insects, snapping them up with sharp teeth. Others nipped at small reptiles, or scavenged what the great predators left behind. Their flexibility became another hidden strength. The larger reptiles, though dominant, carried burdens that their smaller rivals did not. Their bodies required vast amounts of food, and when drought struck or forests thinned, hunger gnawed at their survival. The little dinosaurs, by contrast, could make do with less. They ate what they could find, lived where they could hide, and fled when danger grew too close. They were overlooked, dismissed as unimportant beside the giants, but in silence and shadow they were learning the skills that would one day elevate them. Imagine a dry Triassic plain at dusk. The air hums with insects, and the heat of the day radiates from the ground. A herd of heavy reptiles, their backs ridged with armor, moves slowly toward a river to drink. Overhead, a pterosaur glides, its wings stretched against the fading sun. In the grass at the edges of the plain, a small dinosaur crouches. It is no longer than a man's arm, its head twitching from side to side as it watches. The armored beasts are too large, too dangerous, but it is not hunting them. Instead, its keen eyes fix on the scurrying of a lizard in the dust. In an instant, the little dinosaur bursts forward, swift as lightning, its long legs carrying it in a blur until its jaws snap shut around its prey. It pauses, alert for danger, then darts away again into the brush. Scenes like this played out in countless corners of Pangaea. The early dinosaurs were rarely noticed, for they made little impression on the landscapes compared to the giants around them. But they multiplied quietly, their numbers growing, their skills sharpening. Each success in survival passed on to the next generation, each adaptation honed by struggle. They were not yet the rulers of Earth, but they were waiting, ready for their chance. Over time, diversity began to blossom. Some early dinosaurs became dedicated hunters, their teeth serrated and sharp, their bodies built for pursuit. Others leaned toward a plant-eating life, their necks stretching longer to browse on leaves, their teeth flattening to grind vegetation. They were still modest compared to the titans of later ages, but the outlines of their future empire were already being sketched in the dust of the Triassic. Still, their journey was far from assured. The dominant archosaurs loomed large, and many times the early dinosaurs must have seemed destined to remain minor players, overshadowed and outmatched. Yet Earth's story is never still. Climate shifted, ecosystems faltered, and each disruption tilted the balance. With every upheaval, the giants faced risks they could not overcome. With every shift, the small and nimble gained ground. The very traits that once forced the dinosaurs into the shadows became the tools that allowed them to survive when others fell. The rise of the dinosaurs was not a sudden conquest but a gradual, patient climb. It began with those small, quick creatures darting between the feet of giants, overlooked and underestimated. It grew with each generation that ran a little faster, that endured a little longer, that fed on scraps others ignored. Step by step, they sharpened their abilities, until the qualities that had once been mere survival tricks became the foundations of dominance. The Triassic world belonged to others, but the first dinosaurs endured within it, waiting for the day when fate and fortune would turn. In their hollow bones and nimble strides, the future was already written. They were not yet the kings of Earth, but they were the heirs in waiting, small sparks of resilience that would one day ignite into a reign lasting more than 150 million years. The Triassic world was alive with noise and motion, a place where survival was a contest fought every hour of every day. Across the vast plains of Pangaea, reptiles of all shapes and sizes prowled, lumbered, and hunted. Crocodile-like predators waded in the rivers, armored beasts grazed among the cycads, and swift lizards darted through the brush. In such a crowded, dangerous landscape, only the most adaptable creatures could thrive. It was here, in this crucible of competition, that the dinosaurs began to show what set them apart. At first glance, they were not imposing. Most of the earliest dinosaurs were no larger than dogs, thin-bodied and long-legged. Yet within those slender frames lay a set of traits that would prove revolutionary. Unlike most of their reptilian rivals, whose legs sprawled outward like those of lizards and crocodiles, dinosaurs carried their legs directly beneath their bodies. This upright stance gave them an enormous advantage. Where sprawling creatures moved with an awkward, side-to-side gait that wasted energy, dinosaurs could run with efficiency, their steps long and balanced. They could move farther and faster without tiring, a gift in a land where both predators and prey relied on endurance. Imagine the chase. A heavy predator with splayed legs surges forward, jaws open, eyes locked on its target. Its body sways clumsily as it runs, its muscles burning quickly with the effort. Ahead, a small dinosaur darts away, its movements smooth and efficient. Each stride propels it forward like a spring released. It breathes easily, its chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matches its motion. The distance between hunter and hunted grows, not because of size or strength, but because of design. By the time the predator falters, gasping and slowing, the little dinosaur is gone, vanishing into safety. The difference lay not only in legs, but in lungs. Early dinosaurs had respiratory systems that worked more efficiently than those of most other reptiles. Their lungs were supported by a network of air sacs that kept oxygen flowing continuously, even as they exhaled. This meant their muscles stayed fueled longer, their endurance greater. In a world where sudden droughts, searing heat, and long migrations could make life punishing, this trait was no small gift. Strong lungs and upright legs combined to make them masters of movement, creatures built for survival in a harsh and unpredictable age. Speed and stamina were only part of the story. Dinosaurs were also equipped with agility and balance that few rivals could match. Their tails, long and stiff, acted like counterweights as they ran, keeping their bodies steady during quick turns. Some rose onto two legs, freeing their forelimbs for grasping and clutching. Where other reptiles struggled to change direction quickly, dinosaurs could pivot and dart, turning hunts into ambushes and escapes into narrow victories. This nimbleness gave them a freedom of movement that allowed them to explore new niches, from open plains to forest edges. To the larger reptiles of the Triassic, these new competitors may have seemed insignificant. Giants like Postosuchus, with its massive skull and crushing jaws, were the terror of the land. Heavily armored grazers like Desmatosuchus wandered in herds, their backs protected by ridged plates and spikes. For a time, these animals still ruled. But they carried the weight of their size and structure. They were slow to adapt, their bodies suited only for certain roles. Dinosaurs, by contrast, were versatile. Their efficiency let them thrive where food was scarce, where water was distant, where danger required flight instead of fight. They could survive on less, travel farther, and endure more. Slowly, the balance began to shift. Where once the giants had dominated every landscape, dinosaurs crept into the gaps, their numbers growing, their presence spreading. They were not bound to the swamps and rivers as many reptiles were. They could range widely across the dry interior plains, chasing small prey or nibbling on the hardy plants that grew there. They could follow herds, or scatter into the forests, or establish themselves in places where larger creatures could not tread. Each adaptation made them harder to displace, each advantage building upon the last. The world itself seemed to favor them. The Triassic was unstable, its climate unpredictable, its ecosystems fragile. Volcanic activity belched smoke and ash, raising and lowering temperatures. Rainfall shifted wildly, creating periods of flood followed by long droughts. In such a world, inflexible creatures often vanished, their survival tied too tightly to one way of life. Dinosaurs, with their efficient bodies and restless energy, bent without breaking. They endured the floods, the fires, the droughts, where others faltered. And every time disaster swept through, it left the dinosaurs with fewer rivals and more room to grow. Picture a band of early plant-eating dinosaurs on a Triassic plain. They are modest in size, long-necked and lightly built, feeding on the leaves of low shrubs. Nearby, a heavier reptile lumbers toward the same patch of greenery. Its breath comes hard, its body slow in the heat of the day. By the time it reaches the plants, much of the food is gone. The nimble dinosaurs have already moved on, traveling quickly to the next stand of vegetation. Their legs carry them easily across the landscape, while the larger creature lingers behind, bound to slower rhythms. Such moments played out again and again, giving dinosaurs the edge in both survival and expansion. Predators, too, benefited from these traits. The first meat-eating dinosaurs were not enormous, but their speed and endurance made them deadly hunters. They could outpace most prey, striking with quick jaws and sharp teeth, or scavenge with persistence, following carcasses over long distances that would exhaust other creatures. Over generations, some grew larger, their hunting strategies more refined. They were not yet the tyrants of the later Mesozoic, but their rise had begun, built on the same foundation of lungs, legs, and movement that set all dinosaurs apart. It is easy, looking back, to see this as destiny, as if dinosaurs were always meant to rule. But in the Triassic, nothing was guaranteed. They lived beside powerful rivals, their survival never secure. What carried them forward was not strength alone, but efficiency. Upright stance, strong lungs, quick stride, these were small details of anatomy, but in the crucible of evolution, small details can decide the future of entire worlds. And so, from fragile beginnings, the dinosaurs began to climb. They were still outnumbered by other reptiles, still overshadowed by giants, but each season tilted the balance a little more in their favor. What seemed like minor advantages in one age became decisive weapons in the next. They were survivors first, competitors second, conquerors only after long ages of persistence. The Triassic belonged to many, but it was the dinosaurs who, step by step, stride by stride, were preparing to seize the ages ahead. The breakthrough had come quietly, not in the form of sudden dominance, but in the steady proof that their bodies worked better than those of almost every rival. In a world of chaos, efficiency was power. And with every race run, every chase won, every dry season endured, the dinosaurs carried that power further, toward the moment when they would no longer be small shadows at the edges of the stage, but the stars of the greatest drama life had ever produced. The world changed again as the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic. The scars of extinction had long been covered in green, and the once barren plains of Pangaea now rippled with forests of conifers and groves of cycads. Rivers wound across fertile valleys, and ferns blanketed the damp ground beneath towering trees. The air was warm, the climate stable compared to the chaos of earlier ages, and life seized the opportunity to flourish. It was in this setting that the dinosaurs stepped into their full power, expanding across the continents and transforming into shapes and sizes that seemed beyond imagination. What had begun as small, nimble creatures running at the edges of survival became a dynasty of titans. From the same blueprint of upright legs, strong lungs, and efficient bodies, evolution crafted an astonishing variety of forms. Some grew to heights that dwarfed every animal that had come before, while others sharpened themselves into the fiercest hunters the earth had ever known. The stage was no longer shared so equally, dinosaurs were now the undisputed rulers of the land. Among the most extraordinary of their kind were the sauropods, the long-necked giants. Rising on pillar-like legs, their bodies stretched into immense lengths, their necks soaring into the treetops. With each sweep of their heads, they stripped branches of their leaves, feeding on vegetation that no other creature could reach. In herds, they moved like living mountains across the plains, shaking the ground with their weight, their sheer size a defense against nearly any predator. Creatures such as Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus became symbols of scale, so vast that even the rivers had to bend around their paths. Their success lay in bulk and height, in taking a resource few others could reach and turning it into strength. But where there are giants, there are hunters. Fierce theropods rose to match the age of colossi. Their bodies were built for speed and power, their jaws lined with sharp, serrated teeth. Eyes set forward gave them keen vision, and their long tails balanced their strides as they ran. Some were sleek and fast, chasing prey across open ground, while others grew massive and fearsome, stalking forests and plains alike. Allosaurus stood among these early kings of predation, a hunter strong enough to challenge even the giants of its time. In the later ages, theropods would give rise to the infamous Tyrannosaurus rex, but even in the Jurassic, they were already apex predators, the terror of their ecosystems. Not all dinosaurs relied on size or sharpness. Evolution also shaped them into armored herbivores, living fortresses bristling with spikes and plates. Stegosaurus, with its distinctive row of bony plates rising along its back and its spiked tail ready to lash at attackers, was one such creation. Others would follow, covered in even heavier armor, their bodies protected like walking tanks. These herbivores stood as a reminder that in nature, defense can be as powerful as attack. Together with the herds of sauropods and the swift-footed plant-eaters, they filled the landscapes with variety, each adapted to survive in its own way. Even the skies were claimed. Though not true dinosaurs, the pterosaurs were close relatives, and they shared the world with their towering cousins. From small gliders with fragile wings to giants like Pteranodon, whose wings stretched wider than the span of two men, they turned the open air into another realm of life. They soared over coastlines, diving for fish, or circled above the forests, their shadows sweeping across the ground below. Their mastery of flight completed the dinosaurs' reach, land, sky, and, in some cases, even the edges of the seas. What made this expansion possible was not simply chance, but adaptability. Dinosaurs were not a single form, frozen in design. They were a flexible lineage, able to evolve into whatever shape the world required. When vegetation grew taller, some reached higher. When predators grew stronger, prey developed armor or speed. When opportunities arose in the air, wings spread. Every change in climate, every shift in environment, became fuel for new experiments in form. The result was a dynasty that filled nearly every ecological role on land. The continents themselves were slowly moving, their plates drifting apart, cracking Pangaea into separate lands. Where once a single supercontinent had allowed creatures to spread without limit, new oceans began to divide the world. Yet rather than diminish them, this division only expanded the dinosaurs' variety. Isolated populations adapted to their own environments, producing new species, new body shapes, new strategies for survival. On one continent, herds of colossal sauropods roamed; on another, swift raptors hunted in packs. Diversity exploded as the earth itself reshaped beneath their feet. Life during this time was not without danger. Volcanoes still erupted, and storms swept across the continents. Droughts and floods tested the strength of even the most resilient herds. But the dinosaurs endured these challenges, and more often than not, they thrived. Their traits, the upright stance, the strong lungs, the efficient movement, were no longer just tools for survival. They had become the foundation for domination, allowing these creatures to spread and diversify in ways unmatched by their rivals. For millions of years, they were the defining feature of Earth's landscapes. Imagine standing on a Jurassic plain; before you stretches a herd of sauropods, their necks weaving gracefully as they graze from the treetops. Along the edges, stegosaurs feed cautiously, their tails twitching, plates glowing in the sunlight. Suddenly, a cry cuts through the air. A theropod, lean and hungry, approaches, its gaze fixed on a slower member of the herd. The ground trembles as the sauropods shift away, the armored giants form a wall of spikes, and the predator circles, calculating its next move. Above, a pterosaur wheels through the clouds, its shadow gliding over the scene. It is a world alive with motion, with struggle, with power. A world that belongs utterly to the dinosaurs. This expansion was not a brief triumph but an enduring reign. For over 100 million years, dinosaurs held their place at the top. Generations came and went, species rose and fell, but always others stepped forward to take their place. Their variety was their strength, their adaptability their secret. No matter what the earth threw at them, they answered with new shapes, new strategies, new marvels. The age of dinosaurs had reached its height. From small survivors of a harsh Triassic world, they had grown into the greatest rulers the planet had ever seen. They were not simply creatures of one kind but a vast and astonishing array, from the mightiest of giants to the swiftest of hunters, from armored defenders to masters of the skies. The world had given them a chance, and they had seized it fully, spreading across the continents, filling the land with their thunderous steps and their cries. For now, it seemed they would rule forever. By the time the Jurassic world had matured, the dinosaurs were no longer just survivors or opportunists. They had become architects of their ecosystems, shaping the very landscapes they inhabited. Every niche on land seemed to hold one of their kind. Where once they had been small, quick-footed underdogs, they now spread in forms so diverse that together they formed a living tapestry of life, stretching from the shadowed forests to the open plains and even into the skies. On the great plains of the continents, sauropods reigned in herds so vast they seemed like moving landforms. Diplodocus and its kin stretched longer than modern whales, their necks sweeping across entire groves of vegetation. When they passed through, forests bore the marks of their feeding, trees stripped of leaves, branches bent or broken. The ground quivered beneath their tread, and the dust rose in clouds as their columns moved from one feeding ground to another. These colossal herds reshaped their environments much as elephants do today, clearing paths, scattering seeds, and maintaining the balance of plant life. Among the giants roamed the armored ones. Stegosaurus lumbered on stiff legs, its back lined with tall plates and its tail bristling with wicked spikes. It fed low, cropping ferns and cycads, a living fortress designed for defense rather than speed. Later, ankylosaurs would appear, low-slung and heavily armored, their bodies covered in bony shields, some with clubs at the ends of their tails. These creatures filled the role of slow but steady grazers, their defenses deterring even the hungriest predators. Together with the towering sauropods, they created herds that no single hunter could easily bring down. Yet not all herbivores relied on armor or sheer size. Many were built for speed and numbers. Ornithopods, nimble and social, formed flocks that darted across meadows and floodplains. They grazed on low plants, constantly alert to danger, their survival depending on quickness and coordination. Some evolved the ability to rear up on two legs, scanning their surroundings for threats, before dropping back down to all fours to feed. Their herds rippled like schools of fish across the land, each individual small and vulnerable, but together overwhelming in number. They filled the role of the everyday grazers, the heartbeat of the ecosystem, feeding the predators and sustaining the balance of life. Predators, in turn, came in many forms. Not every theropod was a giant hunter like Allosaurus. Many were small, swift, and cunning, chasing insects, lizards, or the young of larger species. Some were no bigger than turkeys, darting through undergrowth, their eyes sharp and their movements quick as flashes of light. Others were pack hunters, using teamwork to bring down prey larger than themselves. They filled niches from tiny insect catchers to apex hunters, ensuring that no opportunity for predation went unused. In every size, in every environment, there was a predator perfectly matched to its role. The skies, too, belonged to this age. Pterosaurs wheeled over rivers and coastlines, their wings catching the winds. Small ones flitted above forests like dragonflies of bone and leather, while larger species soared high, their wingspans stretching wider than the length of a man. Some dived for fish, skimming the surface of the water with long, toothed jaws. Others may have stalked inland, scavenging from carcasses or plucking small prey from the ground. The air was not empty, it was alive with these strange flyers, filling yet another role in the ecosystem. Though not dinosaurs themselves, early birds also began to appear, their feathers catching the sunlight as they leapt from branches and glided between trees. They were descendants of small theropods, a hint of the lineage that would one day survive beyond all others. For now, they shared the skies with the pterosaurs, a testament to the diversity of forms that evolution could create. Even the waters bore signs of dinosaur influence. Though true dinosaurs did not live in the seas, the great rivers and coastal regions were shaped by their presence. Herds came to drink, trampling riverbanks and stirring up mud. Carcasses washed into the waters, feeding fish and aquatic reptiles. Along the edges, some dinosaurs adapted to hunt in shallow streams, snapping at fish or small amphibians. They were not masters of the oceans. That title belonged to ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and other marine reptiles, but their reach still extended to the water's edge, ensuring their presence touched every part of the ecosystem. What made this diversity so remarkable was not simply the number of species, but the way they mirrored and replaced the roles of animals we know today. Sauropods filled the niche of elephants, reshaping vegetation with their feeding. Ornithopods moved like antelope or deer, grazing in herds and fleeing at the first sign of predators. Theropods echoed the roles of wolves, lions, and hawks, hunting with precision and power. Armored dinosaurs took the place of rhinos or bison, defensive giants that demanded respect. Together, they created ecosystems as complex and balanced as any seen in the modern world, only far grander in scale. This variety also gave them resilience. When climates shifted or disasters struck, some species might fall, but others thrived. If a drought withered the forests, swift grazers could move to new ground. If predators grew too powerful, armor and size offered protection. If one lineage failed, another stepped forward to fill its role. Diversity was their shield against extinction, the secret to their dominance across millions of years. For the people who study these ancient worlds today, the story is told not only in bones but in the landscapes those bones once walked. Fossil beds reveal entire communities frozen in time, a herd of sauropods preserved mid-migration, the remains of predators scattered among them, nests of eggs belonging to small dinosaurs, showing their care for offspring, trackways pressed into stone, recording the paths of herds across ancient mudflats. Each discovery adds to the picture of a world brimming with variety, where dinosaurs filled nearly every possible role life could take. It is tempting to imagine standing in such a place, to feel the ground tremble beneath the passing of a sauropod herd, to hear the calls of horned herbivores warning of predators, to watch a pterosaur dive from the sky. The diversity of dinosaurs was not simply a matter of shapes and sizes, it was a living, breathing world, rich and dynamic, as full of drama and struggle as any savanna or rainforest today. For more than 100 million years, this balance held. The dinosaurs filled the earth with life in its most astonishing forms, building ecosystems that thrived and evolved with them. From tiny hunters darting in the shadows to ocean-like herds stretching across the plains, from armored giants to winged masters of the air, they showed the full power of evolution's creativity. They were not just rulers by strength, but by variety, by their ability to occupy every space, every role, every possibility that the land offered. It was their diversity that made them kings of the Mesozoic, and their diversity that kept them there for so long. The world of the dinosaurs was as varied and dramatic as the creatures themselves. The land stretched across shifting continents, torn by fire and shaped by storms, a planet alive with restless energy. Mountains rose where plates collided, rivers carved valleys through ancient stone, and forests spread across plains that once lay barren. The landscapes of the Mesozoic were never still, and in their restless beauty the dinosaurs thrived. To the west of Pangaea, volcanoes erupted in fiery chains, spilling lava across the land in rivers of molten rock. Ash darkened the skies, turning day to twilight as it drifted across forests and plains. Yet from this destruction came renewal. The volcanic soils, rich in minerals, nourished life once the fires cooled. Ferns and cycads sprouted in the fresh ground, followed by towering conifers that rooted deep in the new earth. Herds of dinosaurs soon followed, drawn to the young plants that carpeted the blackened fields. Life rose again from fire, and the creatures that grazed and hunted here lived in the shadow of smoke that reminded them, always, of the earth's power to both destroy and create. Beyond the fiery highlands lay forests so lush they seemed endless. Conifers towered like living pillars, their trunks stretching high before branching into green crowns that dappled the forest floor with light. Beneath them grew thickets of cycads and horsetails, while ferns unfurled their delicate fronds in the shade. The air was thick with humidity, the calls of insects and the cries of reptiles echoing through the canopy. Here, smaller dinosaurs thrived, weaving between trees on nimble legs, while larger ones pushed through the undergrowth with sheer force. Herds browsed among the plants, stripping branches of their leaves, leaving behind trails of broken foliage that marked their passing. Predators lurked in the shadows, their movements masked by the dense greenery, their eyes glinting through the gloom. In these forests, life was constant motion, the rustle of leaves, the sudden crash of something fleeing, the silence that followed a successful hunt. Farther inland stretched deserts of staggering scale. Pangaea's heart lay far from the sea, its climate hot and dry, its land a vast expanse of red rock and shifting dunes. The sun blazed without mercy, baking the ground until cracks split the earth, while dust storms whipped across the barren land. Yet even here, giants walked. Sauropods moved in slow, determined lines, their long necks swaying as they traveled between oases. They were living caravans, capable of enduring the dry marches by feeding on whatever sparse vegetation they could find. Their size allowed them to travel great distances without constant water, their herds leaving trails of footprints across the sand that hardened into stone and remain visible to this day. Predators followed at a distance, biding their time, waiting for a straggler to falter. In this harsh place, survival demanded endurance, and those who endured were magnificent. The coastlines told another story. Where land met sea, wetlands flourished, rich with vegetation and alive with creatures. Rivers spilled into deltas, carrying nutrients that turned the shores into feeding grounds. Herds gathered along the banks to drink, their movements churning mud into deep tracks. Pterosaurs soared above, diving into the waves for fish, their wings casting shadows over the surf. In shallow waters, marine reptiles ruled, ichthyosaurs sleek as dolphins, plesiosaurs with long necks and powerful flippers gliding beneath the surface. Though dinosaurs themselves rarely entered the deep waters, their presence shaped these coastal worlds, for their movements on land fed the rivers with debris and carcasses, nourishing fish and scavengers. The boundary between land and sea was alive with activity, a place of mingling worlds. Mountains, too, rose across this ancient earth. Some formed jagged ranges where plates collided, their peaks capped with snow that melted into rivers below. Others were the remnants of volcanoes long cooled, their slopes clothed in forests. Dinosaurs roamed even here, though differently than on the plains. Smaller, sure-footed species clambered along the rocky heights, feeding on hardy plants that grew between stones. Predators followed, leaner and more agile than their lowland cousins, adapted to the steep terrain. From the peaks, one could look down on a world alive with movement, herds marching across plains, forests stretching unbroken to the horizon, rivers glinting like silver threads in the sun. It was a view of a planet in the height of its vitality, every space filled with life. Seasonal change added further drama. In some regions, rains fell in torrents, turning dry riverbeds into raging floods. Forest floors disappeared beneath water, and plains became temporary lakes. Dinosaurs adapted to these cycles, migrating to higher ground or moving with the seasons. In dry times, they pressed together near rivers, their herds mingling as resources shrank. In wet times, they spread wide, reclaiming the land as it bloomed green again. These rhythms shaped their behavior, their migrations written into the very pulse of the earth. The air itself was different. Oxygen levels were lower than today, and the heat often oppressive. Yet life had adjusted. Dinosaurs' efficient lungs allowed them to thrive where others might have struggled. The skies, though, were never empty. Pterosaurs wheeled overhead, their calls echoing, while early birds flitted through the trees, their feathers flashing in the sunlight. Clouds of insects swarmed, feeding on plants and themselves feeding countless smaller reptiles. The buzzing and chirping added their own music to the landscapes, a constant reminder that life teemed at every scale. Each landscape carried its own dangers. Volcanoes could smother entire regions in ash, suffocating plants and animals alike. Forests could ignite in firestorms, sweeping miles in a day. Deserts could stretch for weeks without water, claiming the weak. Floods could drown nests, washing away entire generations. Yet in every corner, dinosaurs endured. Their variety gave them strength, some large, some small, some armored, some swift, some that grazed high, others that browsed low. Whatever the land offered, they adapted to it, filled it, and made it their own. To walk through such a world would have been to witness the earth at its most alive. A traveler might cross black volcanic fields still steaming from eruptions, step into forests humming with insects and birds, climb mountains above herds that thundered across the plains, and descend into deserts where giants trudged through endless dunes. Every horizon would carry the silhouettes of dinosaurs, their bodies moving with the landscapes, as much a part of the earth as the trees and rivers themselves. It was this richness of setting, this diversity of environments, that allowed dinosaurs to flourish as they did. They were not bound to a single kind of world. They roamed the fiery highlands, the green forests, the red deserts, the silver coasts, the snowy peaks. They belonged everywhere, and in belonging everywhere, they became the undisputed rulers of their age. For millions upon millions of years, these landscapes pulsed with life, the earth itself restless beneath their feet. The continents drifted and broke apart, volcanoes erupted, climates shifted, but always the dinosaurs adapted. Their world was not static, but alive with change, and in that change they found their strength. The landscapes of the Mesozoic were not just backdrops to their story. They were characters in it, shaping and testing the creatures that lived upon them. Fire, forest, desert, mountain, and sea all played their part. Together they created a world worthy of giants, a stage vast and varied enough to hold the most extraordinary reign the earth has ever known. In the later chapters of the Age of Dinosaurs, certain creatures rose to such prominence that they seemed to embody the strength, resilience, and majesty of their kind. They were not alone, for countless species shared their world, but their forms have come to stand as symbols of an age when reptiles ruled the earth. To speak of dinosaurs today is often to picture these giants, the towering Brachiosaurus, the horned Triceratops, and the mighty Tyrannosaurus rex. Each carried the mark of its lineage, yet each also represented something greater, the triumph of life in its most extraordinary shapes. In the Jurassic forests, Brachiosaurus strode with a grace that belied its size. Its body was a mountain of flesh and bone, yet it moved with steady confidence, its forelimbs longer than its hind, its neck rising like a living crane toward the canopy. While other sauropods swept their heads low across ferns and shrubs, Brachiosaurus claimed the treetops, feeding where few could reach. The sheer height of its frame made it a master of its world, towering above predators that could only circle and glare. Herds of these giants must have been astonishing sights, their heads swaying among conifer branches, their shadows stretching long across the plains. When they moved together, the earth trembled, not with the frenzy of a stampede but with the slow, steady power of creatures that knew nothing could challenge them. To see such a beast was to see time itself in motion. Their lives stretched long, their growth slow and enduring. Generations of trees might rise and fall while a single Brachiosaurus lived and fed. They represented resilience through size and stability, shaping their ecosystems by sheer presence. Entire forests evolved under their feeding, the tallest trees competing to reach higher, the shorter plants finding safety in the shadows of their immense bodies. These giants were engineers of their environments, and their towering forms came to symbolize the age of giants itself. Far later, in the final days of the Cretaceous, another icon rose, Triceratops. Where Brachiosaurus had been a colossus of height, Triceratops was a fortress on 4 legs. Its massive skull carried 3 horns, 2 sweeping forward above its eyes, 1 sharp on its nose, framed by a wide frill of bone that shielded its neck. Its body was stout and powerful, its limbs like columns supporting the weight of its bulk. To a predator, Triceratops was both feast and danger, a living challenge that could mean death as easily as a meal. The herds of Triceratops must have filled the late Cretaceous plains like living battalions, their horns gleaming in the sun as they grazed in groups. They were not only armored defenders but also social animals, their young protected within the circle of adults, their movements coordinated as they shifted across grassless meadows of ferns and flowering plants. When threatened, they could form defensive lines, horns angled outward, eyes fixed on their enemy. The clash between a Triceratops herd and any hunter bold enough to test it was one of nature's greatest battles, strength against strength, courage against hunger. And yet the symbol of predatory power, the figure that towers above all others in the imagination of the modern world, was Tyrannosaurus rex. Its very name, King of the Tyrant Lizards, speaks to its role in this ancient theater. This was no ordinary hunter. It was the culmination of millions of years of predatory evolution, a creature perfected for dominance. With a skull over 1.5 meters long, lined with teeth like serrated knives, it could crush bone with a single bite. Its legs were built for surging speed, carrying its massive frame across plains and forests with shocking force. Its eyes, forward-facing, granted depth of vision rare among reptiles, a predator's gaze honed to track and strike. When Tyrannosaurus strode into view, it carried with it the aura of inevitability. Few creatures could resist its power. Yet even it was no mindless killer. Its senses were keen, its behavior complex. Evidence suggests it scavenged as often as it hunted, claiming carcasses from smaller predators, using its sheer size to dominate. But when it chose to hunt, the results were terrifying. A single charge could scatter herds, and the impact of its jaws was final. It embodied raw predatory might, a figure that has come to define the very image of what it means to be a dinosaur. The confrontation between Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops was perhaps the climactic scene of the Mesozoic world. Predator and prey, evenly matched in strength, both armed with weapons honed by evolution. The hunter with crushing jaws and relentless pursuit, the herbivore with horns and frill, courage and solidarity. Their battles, repeated countless times across the plains of North America, were not struggles of inevitability but of balance. Sometimes the predator triumphed, dragging down its prey with blood and fury. Sometimes the horned defender turned the tide, goring its attacker and sending it limping, broken, into the shadows. These encounters were the living drama of the Cretaceous, the moments that have echoed into modern memory as the defining images of dinosaurs. Yet it is important to remember that these giants were not alone. Their world was alive with countless other species: duck-billed hadrosaurs migrating in vast herds, armored ankylosaurs swinging their tail clubs, small raptors darting through the forests, early birds soaring overhead. But in the tapestry of dinosaur life, Brachiosaurus, Triceratops, and Tyrannosaurus stood out as symbols. Each embodied a different path of resilience, size and endurance, defense and solidarity, predatory dominance. Together they showed the extremes that evolution could achieve, the heights of diversity that the age of dinosaurs allowed. For the young and the curious today, these creatures endure not only because of their bones but because they capture something universal. Brachiosaurus speaks to awe, the grandeur of life raised higher than the trees. Triceratops speaks to courage and protection, the strength to defend family and herd against all odds. Tyrannosaurus Rex speaks to power, the raw force of survival at its most uncompromising. These were not merely animals of their time, they have become symbols that carry meaning across ages. To imagine walking among them is to imagine standing in the climax of an epic story, where every movement was magnified, every encounter charged with significance. The ground shakes with the approach of a Brachiosaurus herd, the air stills as a Triceratops lowers its horns, the silence breaks with the thunderous roar of Tyrannosaurus Rex. They were not just creatures in their ecosystems, they were the defining characters of their stage, the embodiments of power and resilience that still stir the human imagination millions of years after their time has passed. And though their reign would end, their legacy as symbols would endure, reminding us that the Earth has seen ages of grandeur greater than we can fully grasp. In the story of life, these icons remain the unforgettable climax, the living proof of evolution's boundless creativity and the might of creatures who once ruled the world. For millions upon millions of years, the reign of the dinosaurs stretched unbroken. From the Triassic beginnings through the height of the Jurassic and into the long Cretaceous, they held the land in a grip so steady that it seemed eternal. Other creatures lived beside them: birds, mammals, lizards, turtles, insects, and the strange rulers of the seas, but on the continents themselves, it was the dinosaurs who shaped the world. They were not merely inhabitants of Earth. They were its masters. Stability does not mean stillness, for the Earth was always changing. Continents drifted apart, mountains rose, oceans expanded, and climates shifted from steamy jungles to wide, dry plains. Yet no matter what form the land took, dinosaurs adapted. When forests spread, new browsers appeared to strip the leaves. When flowering plants first began to bloom, herds of hadrosaurs and horned dinosaurs fed on their blossoms and leaves. When deserts hardened under a blazing sun, long-necked giants marched across the dust to find hidden oases. They evolved with each passing era, their variety ensuring that change, however great, never broke their hold. This was the secret of their stability: they filled every role so completely that no rival could take their place. On the ground, colossal sauropods were living mountains, eating from the treetops and reshaping the forests. Mid-sized grazers, from horned ceratopsians to duck-billed hadrosaurs, fed on plants closer to the ground and formed herds as vast as any seen among antelope or bison today. Small, nimble species darted among them, quick-footed insect hunters, seed-eaters, or omnivores, their lives woven into the fabric of the larger world. And above them all, theropods kept watch, their sharp eyes and swifter bodies ensuring that no corner of the landscape was free from the hunter's gaze. Predators and prey balanced each other across the ages. The hunters could never consume too much, for their survival depended on the herd's endurance. The herds, in turn, thrived in numbers so great that even the fiercest jaws could not erase them. It was a cycle that endured through eons, a system as steady as the turning of the earth itself. The stability of their reign also came from their resilience to disaster. Volcanoes could bury forests, yet within years green shoots returned, and dinosaurs returned with them. Floods could sweep across plains, yet survivors would migrate to higher ground. Droughts might drive herds to the brink, but their sheer variety ensured that some lineage always endured. Time and again, Earth tested them, and time and again they proved equal to the challenge. For long stretches of history, this balance must have felt unbreakable. A herd of Diplodocus or Brachiosaurus could wander the same floodplain for generations, their tracks pressed into the mud season after season. Armored stegosaurs and ankylosaurs defended themselves against predators in the same forest century after century. Raptors and tyrannosaurs honed their skills, not against strange new enemies, but against the same prey their ancestors had hunted. The rhythms of life were constant, hatchlings cracking from eggs, herds migrating with the rains, predators shadowing their movements. This was not a fleeting moment but an age, a span so vast that human history looks no longer than the blink of an eye beside it. The seas had their own rulers, ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and later mosasaurs, but even here the land's masters cast their influence. Rivers carried carcasses into the waves, feeding scavengers. Coastal forests hosted pterosaurs that soared over the waters, linking the two worlds. Early mammals scurried unseen, but they remained small, confined to niches left untouched. The skies belonged to winged reptiles and birds, the oceans to marine reptiles and fish, but the earth itself, the soil and the forests and the plains, belonged to the dinosaurs. It is difficult to imagine the scale of their dominance. They were not simply one group among many. They were the living core of their ecosystems, present in such numbers and diversity that nearly all land life revolved around them. The air shook with their calls, the ground trembled with their steps. The forests bent beneath their feeding. Wherever one looked, there was a dinosaur to fill the space, whether as a hunter, a grazer, a scavenger, or a flyer. They were not guests of the earth but its rulers, as much a part of the landscape as the rivers or mountains. In this long stability, evolution had time to work its wonders. Lineages branched into countless forms, each perfectly tuned to its way of life. Some became giants whose bones would puzzle future generations with their sheer scale. Others remained small, fast, and sharp, leaving behind delicate tracks or feather impressions in the mud. Some grew armor, some horns, some claws shaped like scythes. Their diversity was not chaotic but balanced, each role fitting into the greater whole. The earth belonged to them not by chance, but because they had earned it through adaptation, resilience, and time. The stability of their reign also gave them something rare: continuity. For more than 150 million years, entire lineages persisted. A human might trace only a few thousand years of recorded history, but in the age of dinosaurs, families of creatures could thrive for millions of years with little change. It was as if the earth itself had settled into a long, steady rhythm, a song of survival sung across ages. From a distance in time, their stability feels like eternity. To imagine walking through the late Cretaceous is to see a world in balance. Hadrosaurs graze in wide herds, their heads bobbing in unison. Ceratopsians guard their young in circles of horns and frills. Ankylosaurs drag heavy tails across the ground, armored shells gleaming in the sun. High above, pterosaurs soar on warm currents, while early birds dart through trees that flower with new kinds of plants. And always, in the shadows, theropods watch, their presence a reminder that even in stability, life is sustained by tension between predator and prey. For all this time, there was no rival strong enough to unseat them. Mammals remained small, pterosaurs remained aerial specialists, marine reptiles stayed bound to the seas. Dinosaurs alone walked as kings upon the continents. Their reign was not merely a chapter but an era, a rule so long that the earth itself seemed molded to their forms. It is easy to think of their end, to leap ahead to the cataclysm that would one day sweep them away. Yet to live within their age was to know nothing of that shadow. For millions upon millions of years, the dinosaurs ruled unchallenged. Each sunrise belonged to them, each forest echoed with their calls, each plain bore the imprint of their feet. In their time, the earth was theirs, and theirs alone. The reign of the dinosaurs seemed eternal, but even in ages of stability, the earth never truly stands still. Beneath the surface, continents drifted slowly apart, oceans opened and closed, and forces of fire and stone worked unseen. For millions of years these changes were subtle, almost unnoticeable to the creatures who grazed and hunted across the plains. Yet their effects, carried forward through time, began to reshape the world that dinosaurs had long dominated. Volcanoes were among the first voices of change. In some regions, they erupted with terrifying force, spewing ash and molten rock across wide landscapes. Entire forests could vanish beneath blankets of ash in a single day. Rivers boiled, skies darkened, and creatures fled in confusion. For the dinosaurs who lived there, it was a disaster, yet in time, green shoots pushed through the gray wastelands. New forests grew, richer in minerals, fed by the volcanic soil. Life endured, but the rhythm of destruction and renewal carried a cost. The land grew less predictable, and species had to move or adapt to survive the cycle of fire. Beyond the eruptions, the very shape of the continents shifted. What had once been one immense landmass, Pangaea, continued to break apart. Oceans seeped into rifts, carving new coastlines and flooding lowlands. Where once herds had roamed across vast, uninterrupted plains, now shallow seas split the continents, isolating populations. Dinosaurs that had once been connected were forced into separate worlds. Some flourished in their new domains, evolving unique traits and forms. Others found themselves trapped in shrinking habitats, their kind dwindling with each generation. Sea levels themselves rose and fell with strange irregularity. Sometimes the waters advanced, swallowing coastlines, drowning forests, and turning rich plains into salty lagoons. At other times, the seas retreated, leaving behind vast mudflats and shallow basins. These fluctuations disrupted the balance of life. Coastal species that relied on wetlands and estuaries found their homes constantly shifting. Inland creatures, too, were affected, as the climate changed with the movement of water and heat across the planet. Dinosaurs were resilient, but the constant rearrangement of their world placed pressures even they could not ignore. Climate, too, began to waver. Once, vast parts of the world had been warm and stable, but now seasons grew more intense. Rains came in sudden torrents, flooding valleys, then vanished for long months, leaving the land cracked and dry. Forests that had stood for centuries gave way to open grass-like meadows filled with flowering plants, new food sources that favored some species over others. Herbivores like hadrosaurs thrived on these new plants, evolving specialized jaws and teeth to grind the tough leaves. But older lineages, dependent on cycads and conifers, began to dwindle. Bit by bit, the fabric of life shifted, not through sudden collapse, but through quiet replacement. Even the skies told of change. Ash clouds from eruptions sometimes lingered long enough to cool entire regions, dimming the sun for weeks or months. Temperatures dropped, plants withered, and food grew scarce. The great herds endured, but only by moving vast distances, seeking new feeding grounds. Predators followed, but the chase grew harder as prey thinned. For smaller creatures, these harsh seasons could mean extinction, and once they vanished, the predators that relied on them faltered too. Mammals, still small and overlooked, began to find opportunities in these unsettled times. While dinosaurs remained the rulers of the land, mammals were nimble, quick-breeding, and able to exploit niches left open by shifting ecosystems. They could burrow through ash layers, hide in forests when droughts struck, and feed on insects, seeds, and roots that dinosaurs ignored. Their quiet success was a reminder that stability was not unshakable, that beneath the grandeur of the dinosaurs, other lineages were preparing for futures of their own. For the dinosaurs, these subtle shifts did not immediately spell doom. They adapted as they always had, evolving into new forms, spreading across continents, and mastering new plants and prey. Yet each change placed strain on their once unshakable dominance. Populations that had thrived for millions of years began to thin. Some lineages, like the long-necked sauropods, no longer marched in herds across every continent but retreated to shrinking ranges. Armored dinosaurs grew fewer, their heavy forms less suited to a world of changing plants and landscapes. The balance was not lost all at once, but it began to waver. The seas, too, bore witness to disruption. Marine reptiles that had once flourished saw their numbers shift as ocean chemistry changed. Rising volcanic activity released gases that altered the balance of air and water, at times depleting oxygen in the seas. Whole stretches of ocean became hostile, driving marine life into decline. The coastlines, once teeming with abundance, grew unpredictable, affecting the dinosaurs that had long relied on them as hunting and feeding grounds. For the creatures themselves, life went on. A hadrosaur herd still grazed on flowering plants, a triceratops mother still guarded her young, a tyrannosaurus still hunted beneath the blazing sun. Yet beneath these familiar scenes, the world was shifting in ways no single creature could perceive. The forests were not quite the same as before, the rains not as reliable, the seas not as steady. Subtle changes, layer upon layer, created pressures that tested even the most dominant rulers the earth had ever known. To live in those times was still to see dinosaurs as unchallenged masters. Their calls echoed through the forests, their herds thundered across the plains, their hunters prowled with undiminished power. But time was no longer fully on their side. The earth itself was changing, slowly but relentlessly, setting the stage for trials far greater than any they had faced before. Their stability, once as certain as the rising sun, was beginning to tremble. And though they could not know it, the long reign that had seemed eternal was moving, step by step, toward its end. For most of the age of dinosaurs, mammals lived in the shadows. They were small, quick, and easily overlooked, a scattering of furred creatures no bigger than a mouse, a rat, or at most a badger. While dinosaurs strode across the plains and forests as towering rulers, these quiet survivors scurried in the undergrowth, burrowed into the soil, and searched by night for food. For millions of years they posed no threat, their world limited to scraps of opportunity left untouched by giants. Yet as the ages passed and Earth began to shift, these little animals grew bolder. They were not rulers yet, but they were preparing for a future when the world would belong to them. The mammals' advantage was not in size or strength, for in those measures they could never match the dinosaurs. Instead, their strength lay in adaptability. Unlike reptiles, they carried their own warmth, their bodies fueled by constant heat that allowed them to move even when nights grew cold. When volcanic ash dimmed the sun, they could still forage in the chill while cold-blooded creatures slowed. When drought struck, they did not need the vast quantities of plants that sustained the herds, but could survive on roots, insects, and seeds. They were creatures of resilience, surviving where giants might falter. Their lives were largely nocturnal, a world lit by starlight and the pale glow of the moon. In these hours, when the great predators rested, mammals ventured out. Their senses sharpened for the dark, keen noses, sensitive ears, and eyes suited to dim light. They scurried along forest floors, slipped through underbrush, and dug into the soil to find worms and grubs. By night they feasted on insects that had risen to dominance in the flowering forests, and by day they retreated into burrows, nests, or hollow logs, hidden from the eyes of prowling dinosaurs. Over time, their forms began to branch. Some grew teeth suited for cracking seeds and nuts, taking advantage of the new flowering plants that spread across the Cretaceous world. Others became insect specialists, their jaws lined with sharp cusps to pierce exoskeletons. A few even ventured into water, hunting small fish and amphibians along streams and ponds. They were never many, never dominant, but they were diverse. Each adaptation opened a door to survival in a world where the rules were beginning to shift. The dinosaurs, enormous and powerful, rarely noticed them. A herd of hadrosaurs trampling through a meadow might crush dozens of burrows without ever realizing what lives lay hidden beneath the soil. A predator like Tyrannosaurus would never waste its strength chasing a creature scarcely larger than a squirrel. For most of the Mesozoic, mammals were beneath their notice, like whispers lost beneath a storm. And that was the mammals' greatest protection. They lived unnoticed, and in living unnoticed, they endured. Yet subtle opportunities were appearing. As climates wavered and ecosystems shifted, niches opened. When a patch of forest was buried under volcanic ash, it was often the small, the hidden, the adaptable that survived. While some dinosaur species struggled with sudden losses of habitat or food, mammals slipped into the gaps. They could reproduce quickly, raising young in nests or burrows, often cared for with a level of attention rare among reptiles. This investment gave their offspring a better chance to survive the hazards of a changing world. A single surviving family could repopulate a valley far faster than a herd of giants could recover its numbers. Some mammals grew teeth sharper and more powerful, suited not only for insects but for meat. These hunters stalked small reptiles, young dinosaurs, and even each other. They were still dwarfed by the predators of the age, but their boldness hinted at what would one day come. Others experimented with gliding membranes stretched between their limbs, allowing them to leap from tree to tree under cover of darkness. The forests, alive with flowering plants, insects, and fruits, became havens for these creatures, places where their quickness and agility mattered more than sheer size. The flowering plants themselves played a quiet role in this rise. Unlike conifers and cycads, these new plants produced fruits and seeds rich in energy, perfect food for small, nimble foragers. Mammals with sharp incisors and complex molars could exploit these resources better than most reptiles. In this way, plants and mammals grew together, each offering opportunities the other could use. The spread of flowers across the Cretaceous world meant the spread of new food sources, and mammals were among the first to take full advantage. Still, the dinosaurs remained supreme. Nothing yet suggested their rule was nearing its end. The herds still grazed in numbers that shook the earth, predators still dominated with terrifying precision, and the landscape still bore their stamp. But in the quiet hours of night, in the forgotten corners of forest and stream, a different story was unfolding. Creatures of fur, not scales, were writing the opening lines of a future where dominance would be measured not in size but in adaptability. Their rise was so subtle that no eye at the time could have noticed. Each generation of mammals lived only to survive, to find food, to raise young, to avoid the crushing feet of giants. Yet in those small lives, in their quick breeding and endless flexibility, lay the seeds of something greater. The challenges of the late Mesozoic, the eruptions, the climate shifts, the rising and falling seas, did not break them. They shaped them, honing their resilience and sharpening their wits. The mammals were not rivals yet, but they were becoming survivors of a kind that no disaster could easily erase. To imagine walking in that world is to see two stories unfolding at once. In daylight, the grand saga of dinosaurs dominated the stage, their herds and hunters filling every horizon. But at night, or beneath the roots of trees, or in the quiet of a forest stream, another tale whispered. Tiny, warm-blooded creatures darted in the dark, their lives fragile yet enduring. They were background characters in the great play of the Mesozoic, but in time, when the curtain fell on the dinosaurs, they would step forward into the light. The dinosaurs ruled, unchallenged in power. But in the shadows, their successors were waiting, small and unassuming, already learning the lessons that would make them the rulers of the ages to come. The world of the late Cretaceous still belonged to the dinosaurs. Their herds marched across plains, their predators ruled the hunt, their shadows stretched across forests and floodplains alike. To walk among them would have been to see power and majesty undiminished, triceratops with horns raised against the morning sun, hadrosaurs grazing in endless lines, Tyrannosaurus rex striding through river valleys with the confidence of a king. Yet beneath this grandeur, the empire of the dinosaurs was no longer as unshakable as it once seemed. Cracks were forming in their dominion, subtle at first, but widening with each passing age. The earth itself was restless. Vast volcanic regions erupted again and again, spewing ash and gases into the air. Each eruption was a storm of fire, reshaping landscapes and darkening skies. The ash that fell smothered plants, clogged rivers, and forced herds to migrate in desperate search of food. Even when the skies cleared, the air itself carried invisible burdens, carbon and sulfur, gases that warmed the planet at times and chilled it at others. Seasons grew harsher, more unpredictable. What had once been steady cycles of rain and sun became irregular, testing the resilience of the creatures that depended on them. Sea levels, too, shifted in strange rhythms. Shallow seas crept inland, flooding vast lowlands where dinosaurs had once roamed freely. Regions that had been fertile plains turned into saltwater lagoons, forcing herds to abandon ancestral feeding grounds. Later, the waters retreated, leaving behind swamps and mudflats. Each change demanded adaptation, and though dinosaurs had always been masters of adaptation, the pace of transformation was quickening. Populations became more isolated, cut off by seas and mountains, their ranges shrinking into scattered fragments. In isolation, some flourished briefly in new forms, while others dwindled and disappeared. The spread of flowering plants brought yet another quiet transformation. These new plants, rich in seeds and fruits, spread rapidly across the Cretaceous world. Some dinosaurs, like the duck-billed hadrosaurs, evolved specialized teeth and jaws to grind their tough leaves. They thrived, filling plains with their migrating herds. But others, dependent on older forests of conifers and cycads, struggled as those habitats shrank. Sauropods, once rulers of nearly every continent, began to fade in number. Where once they had been the architects of entire ecosystems, reshaping forests with their size alone, they now lingered in fewer and fewer regions, their dominance no longer certain. Predators, too, felt the strain. The great hunters could not exist without abundant prey, and as herds shifted, populations of carnivores rose and fell in turn. A Tyrannosaurus could still bring down a Triceratops, but if drought weakened the herds or floods scattered them, hunger pressed harder against even the mightiest jaws. Smaller predators adapted more easily, feeding on mammals, reptiles, or fish, but the largest, most specialized hunters depended on stability. Without it, even they were vulnerable. The mammals, though still minor in number, were beginning to take advantage of these cracks. They lived in burrows, fed on seeds, insects, and roots, and reproduced quickly. When disasters struck, they could repopulate far faster than any dinosaur. In the shadows, their quiet success hinted at a future beyond the age of reptiles. They were not yet true rivals, but their presence was a reminder that the balance of power could one day shift. Even the skies revealed signs of change. Pterosaurs, the winged reptiles that had ruled the air for millions of years, began to decline in diversity. In their place, early birds were rising, their feathered wings better suited to new niches. They darted among flowering trees, feeding on fruits and insects, their small forms quick and efficient. What had once been the domain of giants was slowly becoming the realm of smaller, more adaptable flyers. To the dinosaurs themselves, these cracks were invisible. Life went on in its familiar rhythms. Nests were built in riverbanks, eggs carefully guarded until they hatched. Herds migrated with the rains. Mothers shielded their young in circles of horns and frills, predators tested the weak and strayed. The landscape still echoed with the thunder of footsteps, the air still shook with the calls of creatures larger than houses. But from the perspective of time, it is clear that the foundation was beginning to tremble. The world that had nurtured them for so long was shifting beneath their feet. It was not collapse, not yet. The dinosaurs were still the masters of their age. No rival could match their numbers or diversity. They filled nearly every role life could offer, from the smallest feathered hunters to the largest land animals ever to walk the earth. But their dominance had become fragile. They were bound to ecosystems that were changing in ways they could not control, dependent on climates that grew more unpredictable, tied to continents that continued to drift apart. What had once been an empire of unshakable strength had become an empire of balance, and balance can be tipped. To imagine the world then is to see a stage set for greatness and for danger. On the plains, herds of Triceratops still grazed under the watchful eyes of Tyrannosaurus rex. In the forests, hadrosaurs plucked at flowering plants while raptors darted in the shadows. Along the coasts, pterosaurs soared on warm winds, though fewer than before, while early birds flitted between trees. Life still thrived, but every part of the system carried tension, as though stretched too tight. One more disruption, one more push, and the balance could break. The cracks in the empire of the dinosaurs were not their fault. They had ruled through adaptability, resilience, and strength. They had survived volcanoes, droughts, floods, and shifting continents. But Earth's changes were gathering in ways that no strength could resist forever. The age of dinosaurs had lasted longer than any empire in the history of life, but even the greatest reigns are not eternal. They did not know it, of course. To them, life continued as it always had, the sun rising over herds on the move, predators stalking the shadows, forests alive with insects and birds. The world still belonged to them. Yet history was already turning, quietly, slowly, beneath their feet. The empire was still vast, still mighty, but its foundations were fragile now, and the end of its story was drawing near. It was an ordinary day, or so it must have seemed. The herds moved across the plains as they had for millions of years, heads low as they cropped the flowering plants that covered the ground. Predators prowled in the distance, eyes fixed on the weak and the young. In the forests, small mammals scurried in the leaf litter, birds called from branches, and insects hummed in the thick, warm air. Nothing in the rhythm of life suggested that this day would be unlike any other. Yet above, far beyond the sight of any living creature, a wanderer of stone and ice was hurtling toward Earth at a speed faster than anything alive could comprehend. It had traveled for millions of years across the silent reaches of space, and now its journey was about to end. The asteroid was miles wide, larger than a mountain, and it struck with unimaginable force. In an instant, the sky lit brighter than 1,000 suns, and the ground itself trembled as though the world were breaking apart. Where it hit, the shallow seas of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, the ocean vaporized in a roar of steam and fire. Rock melted, water boiled, and shock waves raced outward faster than sound. A crater over 100 miles across yawned in the earth, torn open in a single moment of violence. The immediate destruction was beyond measure. Everything for hundreds of miles around was annihilated in an instant. Forests caught fire, rivers boiled dry, and entire herds vanished in the first breath of the blast. But the catastrophe did not remain confined to the place of impact. The force of the collision sent fire into the skies, molten rock flung so high it rained down across continents. As these fragments blazed back through the atmosphere, they ignited forests half a world away. Within hours, vast stretches of land were burning, the horizon glowing with walls of flame. From the oceans came another terror, tsunamis higher than city walls. They rolled outward from the impact site, racing across seas and crashing against coasts with unstoppable fury. Entire shorelines were swept away, creatures of the shallows drowned or cast far inland, stranded in the receding waves. Marine reptiles, fish, and seabirds alike faced devastation as the seas turned violent. The planet shook as if in agony, and every corner of the world felt the echo. Yet the most deadly blow was still to come. As fires raged and skies burned, fine dust and soot were thrown high into the atmosphere. So much ash and vapor filled the air that sunlight itself began to fade. Daylight dimmed, then dwindled, until the world was cloaked in a choking twilight. Plants withered without sunlight to feed them, and the chains of life that depended on them began to collapse. The dinosaurs, so long the masters of Earth, faced challenges they had never known. Herbivores starved as plants failed, their once abundant feeding grounds reduced to blackened stubble. Without prey, the great predators weakened and fell, their mighty forms no protection against hunger. The very traits that had once made dinosaurs dominant, their size, their need for vast quantities of food, now worked against them. The larger they were, the harder survival became. Smaller creatures fared better. Mammals in their burrows, birds with their quick metabolisms, reptiles and amphibians that could slow their bodies in times of hardship, all found ways to endure. Insects, seeds, and roots still offered food for those who could find them. But for the giants of the age, the darkness was merciless. A triceratops herd might still form a circle to defend their young, but against famine there was no defense. A tyrannosaurus might still roar across a valley, but without prey its strength soon faded. One by one, species that had flourished for millions of years began to vanish. The seas suffered no less. Plankton, the base of the ocean's food chain, withered as sunlight failed to reach the surface. Without plankton, fish populations collapsed. Without fish, marine reptiles and seabirds declined. The oceans grew quieter, emptier, as life faltered in the darkness. What had once been teeming waters became shadows of their former abundance. Fires still smoldered across the continents, filling the air with smoke. Rain mixed with ash to fall as blackened storms, coating the ground with soot. Temperatures swung wildly, searing heat from the fires, followed by chilling cold as sunlight was blocked. The climate grew unstable, a world of extremes that even the most resilient dinosaurs struggled to endure. Weeks passed, then months. The skies remained dim, the earth silent except for the crackle of fires and the groan of wind through dead forests. Fewer and fewer herds moved across the plains, fewer predators prowled the rivers. The age-old sounds of the Mesozoic, the thunder of footsteps, the clash of horns, the calls that once echoed for miles, fell into silence. The empire of the dinosaurs, which had seemed eternal, was ending in a single cataclysm beyond their control. And yet, amid the ruin, life did not end altogether. In burrows beneath the earth, in streams shaded from fire, in nests hidden under fallen logs, survivors endured. Small mammals curled in tunnels, feeding on roots and insects. Birds pecked at seeds and fruit left uneaten in the ashes. Crocodiles slipped into rivers, their cold-blooded bodies able to endure long stretches without food. Turtles buried in mud, amphibians in damp hollows, even tiny lizards under rocks, all clung to survival while the giants fell. The asteroid had struck with sudden fury, but its consequences lingered for years. It reshaped the earth not only in land and sea, but in the balance of life itself. When the skies cleared at last and the forests began to grow again, the world that emerged was no longer the one the dinosaurs had ruled. Their time, which had stretched across more than 160 million years, was over. What remained was silence where once there had been thunder, emptiness where once there had been abundance. Yet from that silence, new voices would rise. The small, the adaptable, the overlooked would inherit a world made new by fire and shadow. The asteroid had ended the reign of the dinosaurs, but it had not ended life. Instead, it had opened a new chapter, one where different creatures would carry the story of Earth forward. The unexpected blow had fallen, sudden and merciless, ending one of the greatest empires in history. And though the dinosaurs did not live to know it, their legacy would endure, not only in the rocks and fossils that told their story, but in the very descendants of the small survivors who lived through the darkness. For from those survivors would come a new dynasty, one that would shape the world in ways no creature could yet imagine. The days after the Great Impact were unlike anything Earth had ever seen. The blast had shaken the planet, the seas had risen in towering waves, and the forests had burned with a fury that turned night into day. Yet the most relentless trial came not in the first moments of fire, but in the long months and years that followed. The skies, once bright with sunlight, grew heavy with dust and ash, a veil so thick that the sun could barely pierce it. The world dimmed, shadows stretched across every land, and the balance of life began to unravel. For the herbivores, the change struck swiftly. These were the creatures that had once lived in abundance, herds of Triceratops, Ankylosaurus, and duck-billed hadrosaurs moving across plains in numbers that shook the earth. Their strength had always come from food, the endless greenery of the Cretaceous world. But when the sunlight vanished, plants withered. Fields of ferns shrank into black stubble, flowering plants drooped and died, and conifer forests stood silent, their needles falling in brown carpets. Without light, there was no growth, and without plants, the vast herds found nothing to sustain them. Starvation swept through the plains. A hadrosaur could strip leaves from branches with its rows of grinding teeth, but teeth meant nothing when the branches were bare. A sauropod could stretch its neck to reach the highest boughs, but the boughs were empty. Even armored Ankylosaurus, whose heavy bodies had once been secure against the jaws of predators, found no defense against hunger. Day by day, the herds thinned, their bones left scattered in the ash-covered soil. For the predators, the struggle came next. A Tyrannosaurus rex could bring down the mightiest prey, its teeth slicing through flesh and bone, but without herds to hunt, its power was useless. A hunter that needed hundreds of pounds of meat each week could not survive when prey grew scarce. The smaller carnivores fared little better. Raptors that once darted through forests, their claws sharp and ready, found their prey gone or starving. The great balance between predator and herbivore collapsed, one half vanishing and dragging the other down with it. The skies offered no refuge. They were dark with smoke and ash, the air itself heavy and choking. Pterosaurs, masters of flight for millions of years, struggled as fish populations in the seas collapsed. With plankton gone from the lightless waters, the chain of life in the oceans crumbled. Fish dwindled, and with them the creatures that depended on them. Pterosaurs wheeled over gray, silent waves, their wings cutting through the air in vain as they searched for food that was no longer there. Even the birds, smaller and more adaptable, faced hardship. Those that could feed on seeds and fruits hidden in the ash-strewn ground managed to cling to survival, but others perished in the dim skies. Temperatures, too, betrayed the dinosaurs. The heat of the fires gave way to cold as the sun's warmth was blocked. Winters deepened into chilling seasons unlike any the world had known before. Cold-blooded reptiles slowed and faltered, unable to find warmth in the dim light. Even warm-blooded creatures felt the strain as food grew scarce. The great lizards, so long adapted to steady climates, found themselves in a world of extremes, blistering firestorms, then bitter cold. Their bodies, built for strength and size, could not adjust quickly enough. Waterways changed as well. Rivers clogged with ash and debris, lakes filled with the remains of forests, and rain fell as blackened storms, heavy with soot. Clean water grew harder to find. Creatures gathered at shrinking pools, weakened and desperate, often clashing for what little remained. Those that had once roamed widely across fertile plains were now trapped in narrow, failing habitats, fighting for survival with each passing day. Amid the collapse, the smaller survivors found their strength. Mammals scurried through burrows, feeding on insects, roots, and whatever scraps remained. Their small bodies needed less food, and their quick breeding allowed them to recover from losses faster than any herd of giants. Birds pecked at seeds that had survived the fires, carrying within them the promise of forests yet to come. Crocodiles slipped into the still waters, conserving their strength, waiting out the famine with patience. Turtles buried themselves in mud, frogs huddled in damp hollows, and insects, hardy and countless, carried on in the shadows. But for the dinosaurs, the age-long rulers, these strategies were beyond reach. They had lived by grandeur, by sheer size, by numbers, by strength, and now the very qualities that had raised them to dominance became their undoing. To be vast was to need more food than the earth could offer. To be specialized was to fail when the familiar disappeared. To depend on the stability of the sunlit world was to collapse when the light was gone. There were moments when the old rhythms still seemed to echo. A lone triceratops might lift its horns against the gray horizon, standing as though ready to defend its kind. A tyrannosaurus might still roar across a valley, its voice carrying over the emptiness. But these were last embers of a fire burning out, gestures of strength in a world that no longer offered them a place. Months stretched into years. The ash began to settle, the skies slowly cleared, and sunlight once more touched the earth. But by then the damage was done. The herds were gone, the predators that had followed them silent. The age of dinosaurs, which had endured for over 160 million years, had ended not with a single blow but with a long, drawn-out struggle for survival, a struggle they could not win. Yet life itself did not end. In the shadows, the small and the overlooked carried on. Seeds hidden in the ground sprouted again, insects buzzed through the clearing skies, mammals raised their young in burrows, and birds spread their wings in the returning light. The world was scarred, but it was not barren. From the ruins of the dinosaurs' empire, a new story was beginning. The giants had fallen, undone not by weakness but by a disaster too great for even their strength. Their bones would lie buried in stone, their forms remembered in fossils, their legacy written into the earth itself. But the planet they had once ruled belonged now to others. The struggle for survival had ended, and from the ashes of loss, the future was waiting. When the darkness began to lift and the sun at last returned to the scarred earth, the world was quieter than it had ever been. The thunder of dinosaur herds was gone. No more did the ground shake under the march of giants, nor did the forests echo with the calls of creatures larger than houses. In their place, the survivors moved cautiously through the ruins. Life had not ended, it had only shifted. And in this new silence, small mammals, once overlooked, once shadows in the age of dinosaurs, emerged into the open. They had endured the catastrophe not by strength or size, but by resilience. In burrows beneath the ground, they had hidden from fire and ash. With quick metabolisms, they had adapted to cold and darkness. They ate what giants ignored: insects, roots, seeds, even carrion. Where a dinosaur needed entire fields of greenery, a mammal could survive on scraps. And when disaster struck, they reproduced quickly, raising young in nests lined with fur or leaves, their care for offspring giving each new generation a better chance than before. These traits, unremarkable in the shadow of dinosaurs, became the keys to survival in a broken world. In the first years after the impact, mammals were small, rarely larger than a modern rat, rabbit, or badger. But their forms were diverse. Some scurried through leaf litter, sharp-toothed hunters of insects and worms. Others foraged for seeds left buried in the ash. Some took to the water, slipping into streams where fish and amphibians still lived. Their quickness, their flexibility, their willingness to adapt allowed them to seize opportunities wherever they arose. As the forests slowly regrew, new food sources spread. Flowering plants, having survived in scattered seeds and roots, flourished once more in the returning sunlight. With them came fruits and nuts, rich stores of energy that mammals were uniquely suited to eat. Their teeth, more complex than those of most reptiles, could grind, shear, and crush. With these tools, they claimed resources that few other survivors could use. Without dinosaurs to dominate the land, niches that had been closed for millions of years suddenly stood open. There were no great herds to block the plains, no towering sauropods to strip the treetops, no apex predators to rule every valley. Into this emptiness, mammals ventured. Some grew larger, testing the boundaries of size. Others developed specialized diets or behaviors. The world that had once been the empire of the dinosaurs began to fill with furred shapes, each generation branching into new forms. The oceans, too, saw change. With the great marine reptiles gone, mammals would one day claim the seas as their own. Though it would take millions of years, whales and dolphins would descend from small land mammals and rise as rulers of the oceans. But on land, the story began more swiftly. Within a few million years of the extinction, mammals had grown to the size of pigs, wolves, and deer, creatures unimaginable during the reign of dinosaurs. Evolution, freed from the shadow of giants, began to move with astonishing speed. The survivors were not alone in their rise. Birds, too, flourished in the new world. Descendants of small feathered dinosaurs, they spread into forests, plains, and skies, filling roles once held by pterosaurs. Together with mammals, they became the new architects of ecosystems. Yet while birds ruled the air, mammals increasingly ruled the land. The path from those early creatures to humans was long and winding, stretching across tens of millions of years. Small insect eaters gave rise to larger omnivores. Some climbed trees, evolving grasping hands and sharp eyes. These would become the primates, a group destined to play a central role in the future. Others returned to the ground, developing speed for open plains. Still others grew thick hides and heavy bodies, ancestors of elephants, rhinos, and hippos. Carnivorous mammals sharpened their teeth and grew in size, becoming wolves, cats, and bears. Each lineage pushed outward, experimenting with the possibilities that a dinosaur-free world allowed. The climate shifted, and with each change, mammals adapted. Ice ages came and went, reshaping continents, carving valleys, and testing resilience once more. Forests gave way to grasslands, and some primates climbed down from trees to walk upright across the savannas. Fire became their tool, and language their bond. The story that had begun with burrowing survivors in the shadows of catastrophe now reached its culmination, the rise of humans. Though separated by millions of years, the link is unbroken. The mammals that endured the darkness carried forward traits that would one day define humanity. Warm-blooded endurance, care for young, adaptability in the face of disaster, all were part of the legacy inherited from those fragile survivors. Without their persistence, the path to humans would never have existed. To imagine that chain is to see history not as sudden leaps, but as an unbroken thread of survival. From tiny creatures gnawing seeds in the ashes of a ruined world came apes building shelters, crafting tools, painting on cave walls. From small survivors came explorers who crossed oceans, thinkers who mapped the stars, builders who raised cities of stone and steel. The fall of the dinosaurs, tragic and final though it was, cleared the way for this unexpected chapter. Yet even as humans stand as heirs to that legacy, the memory of the dinosaurs endures. Their bones, buried in stone, tell of their age of glory. Their descendants still live in birds, every wing beat a faint echo of giants that once soared. And their story, from rise to fall, remains one of Earth's greatest epics, a reminder that no reign, however mighty, is eternal. The mammals that survived the great extinction did not know the role they would play. They lived only to endure, to raise young, to find food in a broken world. Yet from their resilience came the possibility of all that followed. In their smallness lay strength. In their survival lay the future. And from their quiet triumph in the aftermath of catastrophe came the species that now tells their story. The age of dinosaurs ended with fire and shadow. The age of mammals began in silence, in burrows and thickets, among survivors too small to notice. But from those survivors came the next great chapter of Earth's history, the chapter of us. Beneath hills and deserts, under riverbeds and cliffs, in stone layers older than memory, the bones of giants lie waiting. They are silent now, embedded in rock, yet they carry whispers of a world that once was. Each fossil is a fragment of a story told across millions of years, a broken tooth, a footprint pressed into ancient mud, the sweep of a rib cage larger than a house. Together, these remnants speak of the age when dinosaurs ruled the earth, a time when life reached a scale so vast it still humbles us today. The first people to stumble upon such bones could not have known what they truly were. In valleys of Asia, travelers found great skulls weathered from cliffs and imagined dragons, their jaws filled with teeth sharp enough to slay armies. In Europe, fossilized bones were once thought to belong to giants from old legends. Even in the Americas, discoveries of immense bones gave rise to tales of monsters and creatures from forgotten ages. Long before science uncovered the truth, fossils inspired wonder and myth, bridging the gap between human imagination and the deep history of life. It was not until the rise of modern study that the whispers grew clearer. Scholars began to compare bones, to measure and imagine the creatures they once formed. A femur thicker than a man's chest spoke of weight and strength unimaginable. A claw, curved and sharp, hinted at hunters swift and deadly. A long neck vertebra told of creatures who towered above forests, their heads grazing the treetops. Slowly, the image of the dinosaurs emerged, not as dragons or legends, but as living animals, once as real as the birds in the sky or the lizards in the grass. Yet fossils are more than bones. Sometimes they preserve footprints, frozen steps across ancient plains. A line of tracks pressed into stone tells of a herd moving together, their massive feet leaving impressions that would endure for eternity. Another track might show a predator following, its stride steady, the hunt etched forever in the ground. There are even moments caught in fossil form, two dinosaurs locked in combat, a fish mid-swallow of its prey, a feather pressed into fine silt. These are not just relics, they are windows, offering glimpses into worlds no human eye ever saw. In these remains, we learn not only of the dinosaurs' might but of their fragility. Fossils remind us that every creature, no matter how dominant, is bound to time. The bones of a triceratops speak of its strength, horns like spears, but also of its extinction. The teeth of a tyrannosaurus show unmatched power, yet even it could not withstand the great catastrophe that swept the earth. The fossils tell both of triumph and of loss, of empires built and ended, of nature's unending cycle of rise and fall. For those who study them, fossils are like a language written in stone. Paleontologists read the subtle shapes, the wear of teeth, the texture of bone. From these details, they reconstruct entire worlds, climates where ferns grew taller than men, plains where herds stretched beyond sight, skies filled with winged shapes gliding on thermals. Each fossil adds a word, a sentence, a paragraph to the story of life. Together, they reveal the vastness of time, a scale beyond ordinary imagination. To hold a fossil is to touch a fragment of that immensity. Imagine a small child standing before the towering skeleton of a brachiosaurus, its neck arched into the air higher than any house. The bones are silent, yet the shape speaks louder than words. It tells of forests that no longer exist, of creatures that lived and died long before humanity was even imagined. It is a reminder that we are but the newest chapter in an ancient book still being written. And yet, fossils are not only about the past, they shape the present. They inspire art, stories, and dreams. Dinosaurs stride through the imagination of children, artists, and scientists alike. Their forms appear in books, films, museums, and toys, reminders of a time when the earth was not ours but theirs. Their bones, locked in stone, continue to ignite curiosity and wonder, pushing us to ask questions about where we come from and where we are going. Fossils also warn us. They show that no reign lasts forever. The dinosaurs ruled unchallenged for over 160 million years, yet even they could not escape the turning of Earth's wheel. Their extinction reminds us that change is constant, that survival demands adaptability, and that even the greatest can fall. In this way, fossils are teachers, guiding us through their silence, urging us to understand the fragility of life and the responsibility we hold in shaping the future. Every fossil is a message across time. Some are grand, towering skeletons reconstructed in museums, their size overwhelming. Others are small, a delicate feather, a tiny tooth, a trace of skin imprinted in stone. Together, they create a chorus of voices, a memory preserved not in words or stories, but in the very fabric of the earth. The age of dinosaurs is gone, yet through fossils, it lives on. The titans no longer thunder across plains, but their bones remind us that they were real as the animals alive today. They inspire us not because they are gone, but because they connect us to the vastness of life's history, to a time when the world was different and yet bound by the same laws of survival and change. To stand before their remains is to feel both small and connected, to sense the weight of time and the resilience of life. The fossils whisper not only of giants but of continuity, that every end is also a beginning, that from the fall of dinosaurs came birds, mammals, and eventually us. In their silence, they tell us that we too are part of this story, bound to the same earth, subject to the same forces of change. The memory of titans endures not in their bones alone, but in the awe they awaken within us. They remind us to look back with wonder, to look forward with humility, and to recognize that the story of life is larger than any single age, species, or reign. Fossils, those whispers in stone, ensure that the age of dinosaurs is never forgotten. The giants may be gone, but their memory still walks among us, shaping how we see the past, how we imagine the future, and how we understand the fragile, magnificent gift of life itself.